As we wrap up today's episode, what's the one thing you'd like listeners to take away?
I think the biggest lesson in investing is really the idea of continual learning. One of the reasons I think many of us are drawn to this, and especially people who are curious about how the world works, is that you never have the game won. You never have the game beat. There's always something to learn. There's always new information to draw in. So I think the number one thing is to keep learning, have your mind be open. The one quality I really admire in people who make good decisions is this idea of being actively open-minded. I think that would be the one thing I'd want people to take away, is to try to be as actively open-minded as possible.
What a good reminder for all of us.
Yeah, it's a lovely takeaway. Michael, what do you think is the most underappreciated thing about investing?
If I had to say, it would probably be that temperament is more important than smarts. We tend to think that smart people can do better than others, especially in an industry where there are a lot of numbers typically and some things to figure out. But I think if you examine what leads for great investment results over a long period of time, not just a short period of time, but a long period of time, it tends to be temperament. These are people who are able to fill in peaks and valleys. So when people are extremely bullish, you are much more reserved. When people are extremely bearish, you're much more positive. And there are interesting questions about how much of that is sort of in the nature of people and how much of that is something we can build into our organizations. I think it's clearly a combination of those things. But I think the big one is temperament is more important than smarts.
Fantastic. And Michael, you've given us so many recommendations through today's episode. I think I've written down about 6 or 7. Do you have any final recommendations that you'd like to add to that list? We'll link all of them in the show notes.
There's a podcast I listen to, and I'll just mention 3 books that I found to be fun. And I don't even know if I've talked about these. But the first is there's a recent podcast from the Sohn conference this year between John Collison from Stripe and Stan Druckenmiller from Duquesne Capital. And I tweeted about this. I mean, you don't have to agree with what Stan Druckenmiller says about the world to appreciate how extraordinarily thoughtful he is, how wise he is, and that he lays out many lessons that all investors can employ. I thought Collison's questions were quite thoughtful, and Druckenmiller, who's obviously been extraordinary for decades, I thought that was a really fun one. I'll mention 3 books that I've read this year that I've liked. The first is a book called 7 Games. Do you guys know this book by Oliver Roeder?
Nope.
So 7 Games is exactly what it sounds like. He examines 7 games. So it's poker and chess and backgammon and so forth. And he talks about the history of the game. And each chapter, by the way, he talks about how those games, computers, how they became superhuman. So how computers essentially beat those games. And it's quite different for each of them. So it's quite interesting. If you like games, if you like to understand strategy, if you like to understand how computer scientists try to tackle becoming superhuman, that's a fun one. I thought as a fabulous read was Bill Browder's new book called Freezing Order. Many of you know the story about Bill Browder. He wrote a book called Red Notice, but he was a hedge fund manager in Russia. He crossed purposes with Vladimir Putin and the whole administration, so he had to pull out of Russia. But he unfortunately had a lawyer that stayed there to try to defend what they were doing, who was essentially died in jail. And so he's been on a mission to try to obviously sort of straighten things out in the name of this lawyer. But Freezing Order is sort of the next chapter of this. It's like a spy novel. It's unbelievable. Browder's a compelling writer. And so that's a fun one. And it obviously sort of geopolitically relevant. And then the last one I'll just say is the book that I can't get out of my head. Sometimes you read a book and you're, whatever. And then you just can't get the ideas out of your head. Is a new book by Keith Stanovich. And that book is called The Bias That Divides Us. And it's about the concept of confirmation bias. And by the way, of course, having studied this stuff, I went into this book thinking I'm above all this stuff. And you cannot walk away from this book unscathed, recognizing that you are falling for the same thing. So he says, confirmation bias is present when we process information to favor opinions that we hold in high esteem and with great conviction. And his interesting thing is that he says most behavioral biases, almost all of them, are mitigated by some sort of intelligence. If you're a brighter person, you know how to deal with these things and you're better at them, with the exception of confirmation bias, which is really interesting. So you all talk to managers all the time. It's important to recognize that those who are most eloquent are often, in a sense, are the ones that are not mutable, that they're going to stick to these certain points of view. And by the way, he gets into politics at the end, so you may or may not be your taste. But the basic concept of confirmation bias, I think, is a really important read for people, again, to be aware of it. And then what can we do to manage or mitigate it?
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Well, you've given us a whole host of reading material there. Maybe given what time of year we're at, maybe a whole lot of stuff for over the summer, something to keep us all busy on sun lounges or wherever we're going to spend our summer. So thank you so much. Michael, it's been an absolutely brilliant conversation. Thank you so much for your time today.
Dan, Mary, thank you very much. I really enjoyed talking to you.